Hey, everybody. The Beatles, you all know them, universally known for their music and cultural impact, have a rich tapestry of hidden history and unexpected terms that shape their journey from Liverpool lads to global icons. Now, to help us delve into this intriguing, less explored side of the Beatles, we're privileged today to welcome David Bedford. He was born and raised in the same Liverpool neighborhood as Ringo Starr. David's connection to the Beatles world is both personal and profound. He's an author of 7 Beatles biographies, including the critically acclaimed Liddypool, Birthplace of the Beatles, and Finding the Fourth Beatle. David is an unrivaled authority on the Fab Four's history. He spent decades uncovering the facts, debunking the myths, and revealing the truth, captivating narrative of the world's most famous rock band. We're going to have a good time talking about this. I can't wait to ask some questions, and here we go. David, how are you doing today?
I don't think I could pay anybody enough money to write an intro like that. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, you did.
Who's this guy you're talking about?
He's an awesome guy. We're going to talk about the Beatles, and we're doing what, pre-1962, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting years.
Yes, let's jump right into it because the Beatles are fascinating. I mean, like if most bands could have like a career, it's like 1/10 of what they've had, they'd be like famous.
Yes, definitely.
Let's start at the very, very beginning, at least what I know as the beginning. I'll ask the questions and you just tell me the stories, and let's do this.
Sure.
So how did John and Paul McCartney initially meet? And like what led to their decisions to collaborate and make music?
Okay, well, it's one of the biggest coincidences ever. So you've got young John Lennon. He's moved into an area called Woolton in Liverpool, very middle class, villagey feel to Woolton in Liverpool, and he's got this skiffle group called the Quarrymen. Now, skiffle was a musical craze over here. It lasted between 1956 and beginning of 1959. Didn't last long, and it was started by a guy called Lonnie Donegan. Now, Lonnie was in a jazz band, but he loved some of his early songs and Woody Guthrie, Woody Ledbetter, and all those roots country music, all from America. And what they used to do is when they had the Dixieland Jazz concert that they were playing in, you can only play for like 45 minutes, I should say.
I love 45 seconds.
Yeah, 45 minutes, and then you'd need a break to breathe. So in the interval, Lonnie Donegan would come on with a guitar. Somebody had a washboard, somebody'd have a T-chest bass. And this sort of harks back a little bit to the jug bands back in the 1920s America, and they do these skiffle songs. So this song came out as a single beginning of 1956 called Rock Island Line. Again, it's a lead belly song. And it just dominated the charts, and it sold well on both sides of the Atlantic. And instead of, if you wanted a career in music, you had to be a good singer, somebody would sign you, and they get somebody to write a song and give it to you. Lonnie Donegan was saying, grab a guitar, make your own instruments. It doesn't matter. You only need 3 chords, and you can start a group.
No.
And it was brilliant fun. And so John, with some friends at school, starts his group called the Quarrymen sometime around the middle of 1956. So they've been going for about 12 months, and they're playing at a church fete. It's like a summer fair in his local area of Woolton. Now, John had a bit of a reputation among the parents. They were saying to their lads, we don't really want you hanging around with that Lennon. That's how he was known, that Lennon. And so one of his best friends, Ivan Vaughan, really clever lad, real good friends. His parents didn't want him in the same school as John because he was such a distraction. But he said, no, you're going to learn nothing if he's around. You're not going to the same school. So they send him to a completely different school in the city centre. He ends up in a class with the lad born on the same day as him, 18th of June, 1942, whose name is Paul McCartney.
No way.
Yeah. So Ivan and Paul become friends. And it's Ivan who says to Paul, my friend John's got this group. Do you want to come and see them? So Ivan brings Paul and introduces him to John.
Oh, man.
And if it hadn't been for Ivan Vaughan, we would not be having this conversation. There would be no Beatles.
You know what's amazing to me? There's like people can go back and they can go like, I knew them when, right?
Yep.
And you've written a book about the 23 drummers that they had before Ringo. And I wonder how many of those guys are kicking themselves going like, I could have been Beatle. I could have been Beatle.
Well, strangely enough, I had lunch today with Colin Hanton, who was the original drummer with the Quarrymen. So he was their first drummer. And he was with them from 1956 through till early 1959. So he was the first guy. He has no regrets.
No. Well, does he even think about it and say like,
no.
Oh, if I just stayed a little bit longer or anything like that?
No, he's got no regrets. He's had a wonderful life. He's got a lovely family.
Yeah.
Because what could have happened, who knows? So no, he's had a lovely life and he's quite happy. He really is. So he was there that day. John met Paul.
God, can you imagine just being back there and going like, if you could be the fly on the wall and saying,
yeah, definitely. And the funny thing is, and it's one of those jobs of being a historian and a writer, is trying to find out exactly what happened. Now you've got all the lads in the Quarrymen.
Yeah.
But they've all got slightly different memories because they're all like 15 or 16 years old. And I tell them off because nobody was making notes of who said what.
Right.
Shocking. They should have known 70 years, whatever. We want to know what was said. So they've all got slightly different memories. So you have to put an amalgam of those together and think, okay, we know the date, 6th of July, 1957. We know it was St. Peter's Church Hall. And we know this conversation took place because Ivan brings Paul and introduced him to John. And for John, at that stage, skiffle was fun. The Quarrymen was fun. He wanted to be Elvis. He loved Little Richard. He loved Chuck Berry. He loved Buddy Holly. To do that, he needed a better musician. John couldn't play the guitar properly. He played banjo chords because his mum had taught him to play.
Yeah.
So Ivan brings his lad Paul McCartney in. Paul can play the guitar properly. Most impressively, Paul could play a right-handed guitar upside down because Paul's left-handed. The young man can't even tune the thing and play it properly.
Yeah.
This guy tunes the guitar up a little bit, then flips it upside down and starts playing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran, and he can sing. And John said, if I want to do rock and roll, I need that guy in my group. And that is the moment the Beatles begin.
That's amazing. Who were the rest of the people that were there next? Who was next? You got John, you got Paul playing his upside down guitar. Who was next?
Yeah. So after that, that was the last time that Rod Davis, the banjo player, played with the group. So that he was gone. Pete Shotton was John's best mate. He played a washboard. That's not really... Yeah. And that's it. They were homemade instruments, This is what your mum had. Did your washing? You had sewing thimbles, which you could put on your fingers and you go rat-a-tat up and down the washboard for like rhythm section. So that's not a musical instrument. So Pete quit not long after that. Then Garry played a tea-chest bass. Now, a tea-chest bass was a wooden packing case which stood maybe 2 foot off the ground, which we used to import tea leaves in those boxes. You got a broom handle. It's a bit like a bathtub groups that the early American groups had. Tie some string to the top of the broom handle, tie that to the box, pull it tight, go twang. It's a homemade upright bass.
Can I tell you, I thought forever, but those things were just things you saw on TV and that it was just like made up. And you're telling me someone actually played that.
Oh, yeah. They had a few. Len Garry was the guy who was playing it on the day John met Paul.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But of course, it's purely acoustic. They wanted to go to rock and roll. So Len was out the group soon.
Okay.
And then probably about 3 months after Paul had joined, he was doing an instrumental and he made a mess of it. And he said to John, look, I can play guitar. I can play rhythm guitar. I'm not a great lead guitarist. We need a lead guitarist. I know just the lad. So on the bus going to school, they got on a bus stop apart. Paul meets this guy in the year below him called George Harrison. They become friends on the bus going to school. And so they got like 45-minute bus ride either way. And they're both obsessed with music. They start visiting each other's homes and learning guitar together. So Paul says, I can't do lead guitar, but my school friend George can. So he invites George, and George comes to do an audition for John. Now,
Yeah.
we think there was 2, maybe 3 auditions, because George was only 14. John was 17. And that's quite a big gap.
It is at that time, like 14 to 17 is not the same as like 97 to 100. That's the same. Yeah.
No, not at all. It's boys and men. But George played this instrumental called Raunchy. And John just said, he's a great guitarist. He's got to be in the group. And so at the end of 1957, you've got John, Paul, and George together in the group.
Uh-huh.
And that's it. So most of the others are gone. You go into 1958. So within 12 months of Paul and John meeting, the group is completely different.
Wow. Now, were they actually gigging at this time? Did they go out and play? And like when they were playing, what name were they using at that time?
So this was all the Quarrymen. So from when they formed it in 56, they were the Quarrymen right through to nearly the end of 1959.
And where did that name come from, the Quarrymen? That was John's name that he gave the group? That was his original
name? The high school they were at was called Quarry Bank. And the opening line of the school song was Quarrymen, strong before our birth. So they thought, we're at Quarry Bank. There's the line, Quarrymen. Why not? It sounds good. And they just went with it.
So what kind of music were they playing at this time? And were they influenced by American music or by the skiffle? Or what were they playing before they actually landed on the next drummer?
Everything was American influenced. Liverpool, it's a very unique place. You know, this was probably like the second port of the British Empire. It's a hugely important commercial port. History going back to 1207. But in the Second World War, Liverpool was the second most bombed city because of the importance of the docks. So we had 7 miles of docks. So all those supplies that were coming in from the US and Canada to keeping us going, majority of that was coming in through Liverpool. Then when America joins the war, most of the troops, when they came over the Atlantic, came in through Liverpool.
Wow.
A lot of all the supplies was coming in. The tanks and the planes were all coming in through Liverpool. And just outside of Liverpool was an airbase called Burton Wood. And that became the largest operational airbase in Europe during the Second World War. And we ended up with 20,000 US servicemen based there. And I think the last of them must be in the early 1990s.
Wow.
So there was this huge thing of, there's American culture, they're obsessed with cowboy films, absolutely obsessed with them. But then there's thousands of real Americans living just outside of Liverpool who in their downtime would come into the city. So go to like 1960 and they're starting to become a rock and roll group. And we had a large Afro-Caribbean community. So that the black US servicemen would go to the black clubs in Liverpool. Well, John, Paul and George would often be hanging out in those clubs. And so they were talking to Americans who were bringing their records to play. So they were learning everything musically that they wanted to do was American music. So you can see that just behind me, got this one of my recent books, The Country of Liverpool. Yeah. Liverpool had the biggest country and western scene, certainly in Britain, probably in Europe, at the same time that the Beatles was happening. Country music was a massive influence on the Beatles. You know, they loved Hank Williams. Yeah. John particularly was a huge Hank Williams fan. But you think of the artists they wanted to be, you know, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, Elvis, all got their roots, Everly Brothers, all got their roots in country music. So Liverpool had a lot of country music, but it was all Americans. They loved it. And you could get the blues over here because we also had these guys called the Cunard Yanks. And they were Liverpool sailors who sailed on the crossing from Liverpool to New York. Before they came back, they went to the record stores and they bought the cameras and they bought suits and everything. And they brought all of this back to Liverpool. So the Liverpool lads all knew somebody who was on the ships. We're getting access to all this American music before the rest of the UK was. So in some ways, I would say Liverpool looked more across to New York than it does south to London. Wow. Did the Beatles actually? Well, they weren't the Beatles at that time, but did they play country music at the time? Oh yeah, yeah. So if you look at at the earliest Quarrymen business cards, actually right there in the center of the cover, is one of the early Quarrymen business cards, which describes their music: country, western, skiffle, rock and roll. Because what they realized was skiffle music that Lonnie Donegan was playing has most of its roots are in American country and folk. But the 3 chords you learn for skiffle are the same for country, are the same for rock and roll.
Yeah. It's just a beat that changes up.
Exactly. And they suddenly realized that's why skiffle didn't last that long. It was simple. It was fun. But you could then do country and then you could do rock and roll. So skiffle went. Everybody wanted rock and roll. But again, it was all American music. And it's quite amazing that artists like Little Richard and Chuck Berry, that those Black American artists were sometimes more popular over here than they were back in the States.
Yes.
They loved them. John says one of the most important moments in his life was hearing Long Tall Sally by Little Richard for the first time. He said, when I heard it for the first time, it was so great I couldn't speak.
Oh my God. Did they actually get to meet like Little Richard themselves, or were they too young and nobody at the time?
No, they met him. So the year after Brian Epstein became the manager, so they're now the Beatles. And it's
who's the drummer at that time?
So by the time they get to meet Little Richard, Ringo has just taken over from Pete Best. So Pete Best had been the drummer for 2 years. He's replaced just before they get to make the first record. But they get to meet Little Richard. He plays locally here, and the Beatles are second on the bill. There's a great photo of the 4 of them taken with Little Richard. Yeah, because he was like their hero. Because all you think of, She Loves You and stuff, and all the great stuff that Paul would do with the that's all direct from Little Richard. That's stolen straight from him. And Paul could sing like Little Richard could. And do you think the song that defines the Beatles' career is Long Tall Sally?
There we go.
It's just a huge influence on them. The first time they play in the States, a concert over there, like the opening song is Long Tall Sally. The last concert they play at the end of August 1966 in San Francisco, they sign off with Long Tall Sally.
There we go. So there's the tribute right there.
Absolutely. Yeah. They absolutely idolized Little Richard, and they met him again in Hamburg as well. So he was their hero, but they loved all these guys, Buddy Holly especially. Buddy Holly inspired the name Beatles.
Really? How?
Yeah, because Buddy Holly's group were the Crickets.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the bass player in 1960, when they were looking to get rid of the Quarrymen name, and he said, well, if Buddy Holly's got Crickets, we can be Beatles.
Yes.
It's an insect thing.
How did they get rid of Best and bring in Ringo? Because Best didn't want to leave the group, did he?
No, not at all. Why would he?
So how did that happen?
So in August 1960, the Beatles have got a gig to go to Hamburg. A week before they're due to go, their drummer at the time, Norman Chapman, got called up to do his national service in the army. So he had to quit. And they think, well, we've got a week. We've got to find somebody. Well, they knew Pete Best from the Casbah where he played. So they rang Pete on the Friday. He did an audition on the Saturday. They had a run-through on the Sunday. By the Tuesday, they were on the way to Hamburg. But Hamburg is where they become a rock and roll group.
Yeah.
They're playing between 6 and 8 hours a night. And they've got to entertain the crowds. Their job was to bring crowds in off the street into the club to spend money buying the beer.
How many nights a week were they playing that? 6 to 8 hours.
6.
One night is ridiculous.
6 nights a week.
No way.
Yeah.
No wonder they got so good.
Yeah. But and that's it, the great theory of your 10,000 hours. Well, that's sort of what they did on the stages of Hamburg.
Mm-hmm.
And most songs back then lasted, 2.5 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, if you've got to fill up to 8 hours, that's a lot of 2.5 minutes. So what they had to learn to do was get a 2.5 minute song and make it last for 5 or 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they learned to be creative. They developed their stagecraft there, how to entertain an audience. Wow. And they learned that, and suddenly they were the best thing in Hamburg. And when they get back to Liverpool, they're the best thing in Liverpool.
How did they decide who was going to sing what songs? Like how did they decide if John was going to sing or Paul was going to sing?
Or George.
Or
Because
George?
because at the time in Hamburg, they took it in turns, the three of them.
Okay.
Because you had to, because you're doing that long, you had to share out the singing to save your voice. And normally it was, if you suggested a song to the group, then that would be the song that you sang. So they each had their favorite artists. And say, oh, I've got this latest one from Chuck Berry, Memphis, Tennessee. John suggests it, so John sings it.
Dang. And then, so how long were they singing? They're doing covers at the time. When did they start throwing in their music?
It really was when they get into 1962, when Brian Epstein, the manager, gets in front of George Martin, who's looking at offering them an audition for a record contract. By then, Brian's saying, look, record some new material because you're going to need some original songs to record. So they'd had a few, and over the previous, say, 6 months, they'd be singing some of those. But most of the time, they were doing covers. So when it comes to getting in front of George Martin in June 1962, this is really where the change with Pete Best happens. So they go down with the audition, and they do some covers, but they do a couple of their original songs. And one of them they do is Love Me Do, which becomes their first single.
Yeah.
Now, they'd only started working on that again after years, and they were messing around with it in Hamburg, and they changed it around and decided to do a slightly different beat in the middle, etc. But it wasn't polished. So when they record that, it doesn't sound very good. And at the end of the session, Brian Epstein is taken to one side by George Martin. George Martin says, okay, I'm going to have to think about it. I might offer you a deal. If I offer you a record deal, I'm going to bring in a session drummer because your drummer can't quite do what I want them to do for a record.
Oh, that hurts.
But that was normal.
Yeah.
Think of the stories of the Wrecking Crew over in the US.
Yeah.
Session musicians appeared on so many records. Most of the time, nobody knew.
Right.
But Brian didn't know that. John, Paul, and George didn't know that. That was normal policy. So Brian goes to John, Paul, and George and says, if we get the contract, then he doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record. And they're saying, oh, what are we going to do? Every other record company turned them down. This was their last chance of a deal. So they said, well, if we get the contract, we're going to have to replace Pete. So it takes about another 6 weeks before George Martin confirms the contract. So we're getting towards the end of July now. Once they know they got the recording contract, they start then approaching other drummers. And in total, 4 drummers are asked to replace Pete.
Now, what's Pete thinking this whole time?
He doesn't know anything yet.
Oh, man.
He knows nothing. So this is end of July. As far as he's concerned, everything's carrying on as normal. And then he gets a call from Brian, say, can you pop into the office? I just want to have a chat. Now, Pete often did that because he looked after the diary. So he would often meet with Brian and they go through what dates were coming up, etc. And Brian says to him, I don't know how to tell you this, Pete, but the boys want you out.
The boys want you out.
The boys want you out. And it's already been agreed that Ringo's going to join on Saturday. And he's just absolutely stunned. I think, what the hell's going on here? He didn't know what to think. And that was it. Now, this is where it gets very, very interesting and a little bit technical. When I did that book, Finding the Fourth Beatle, I've always been curious as to how it all took place. And we've been told since 1962 that Brian Epstein called Pete into the office and sacked him.
Okay.
And that was it. He was out. I went and interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer. And he said, well, Brian didn't sack him. Brian couldn't sack him because Brian never employed him. If you're going to fire somebody, it has to be an employee. Well, the Beatles employed Brian. Brian didn't employ the Beatles. He had no legal authority to fire him. So that's why Brian never told Pete he was fired, he said, the boys want you out, which is your fellow group members want to get rid of you.
Yeah.
And it's already been agreed that Ringo's going to replace you on Saturday. To which Pete, as a 21-year-old, thinks, I've been fired. But he was never fired.
Yeah.
They tricked him into it.
Now, did the other three actually want him out? Not because he wasn't a good drummer, but because they wanted the record deal, right?
Yeah, that's it. And you can't blame them for that.
Yeah.
If this was their last chance, if they hadn't got a record deal, they would have split up. That would have been the end of it.
Yeah.
This was the very last chance. And if the only thing was going to hold them back was replacing the drummer, then they had to do it.
Wow.
And so you can't blame them for it. In their early 20s, they've been working, they've been slogging for 6 years now. They've worked hard to get to this point. And if that was going to be the difference between the record deal or not, they had to make the change.
That's fabulous story, because I mean, now the fact that they could go in, play covers, and somebody would sign them, that would never happen now. You go in with original music, then you get the producer who rewrites all your stuff, and then they turn you into a star.
Yeah, and all that is down to the Beatles, because they insisted on recording their own original songs.
Mm-hmm.
That gave permission to every singer-songwriter that has followed since then.
So
it changed the music industry.
Yeah. It started when they started playing out as the Beatles, right? Now, when I've seen the videos of them coming to America and everyone going crazy. How did that happen? How did everyone know, oh my God, the British invasion? We got the Beatles coming over. We got the Stones. We got everybody else. How did that just blow up like it blew up?
It's a crazy mixture of events, as is everything with the story of the Beatles. And I often say that if you wrote their story as a work of fiction, nobody would believe it. It's too almost impossible to believe. So 1963 in the UK, the Beatles have got albums at number one. They're the top act. They're doing everything. They go off on their first foreign tour, which is to Sweden. When they come back into London's Heathrow Airport, there's lots of fans there screaming for them.
Really?
Yeah. Walking through the airport at that time was a man called Ed Sullivan, the famous TV host.
Mm-hmm.
He says, what's all that noise about? Who are they all screaming for? It's a group called the Beatles. Oh, I want to know more about them. So Ed Sullivan heads back. Now, Capitol Records, which was the record company in America, weren't particularly interested in promoting the Beatles. So they had a couple of singles out on small independent labels, VJ and Swan.
Mm-hmm.
But they start getting some radio play. They then appear on the Jack Parr show. And he didn't have permission to play it, but he played a bit of the Beatles playing in the UK.
Uh-huh.
I think CBS News covered them. And they were on in the morning. And it's the 22nd of November, 1963. And of course, the evening when they're due to appear again, the assassination of JFK had slightly overtaken the news.
Yeah.
But it's all starting to build some momentum. And then, because radio is so... over here, we just had the BBC, did national radio, that's it. Whereas obviously, it's all the independent local radios over there. And there's a young girl had heard, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so she wrote into a local radio station and said, please play this. I love this song. So she went into the station and announced it.
Uh-huh.
And the switchboard was inundated. And suddenly, every radio station in the States wanted to play I Want to Hold Your Hand. So Capitol Records then thinks, they've done the publicity. Now we're going to sell some records. So then, firstly, there's a guy called Sid Bernstein who booked the Beatles to play at Carnegie Hall. So momentum's building about coming over to the States. Then Ed Sullivan gets in touch with Brian and says, I want to book the Beatles to appear. So by the time the Beatles then land on the 7th of February, 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hands at number one. They're known across the US. They've been all over TV and radio. They've been in the local press. There's a great version of Time magazine had featured the Beatles the week before. So by the time they land at JFK Airport in New York, there's thousands out there, and they're mobbed everywhere they go. And then Sunday night, Ed Sullivan Show, 73 million people watched them.
It's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. I mean, you know how they take the, currency now and they say, well, $5 back then is now, $100 now, but 70 million people back then, that's got to be like the entire US. That's
well, I mean, whether it's true or not, but they do say that actually for the time the Beatles were on television, the crime rate actually dropped.
I feel that. I can see that happening. I mean, there's stars now, right? But nobody goes out to the airports to like see your star come in. Nobody.
No,
and that's just an astounding thing. Gosh.
And imagine that they were such young lads.
Yeah.
Ringo and John are the oldest. They're 22. So the 22, 21, 20. That sort of age when suddenly you conquered Britain. That was more than they ever expected. No British artist had truly broken America. But of course, they wanted to be in America because their music, if you think about it, was they played American music. They then put a Liverpool twist on it, wrote their original songs in that style, and then sold it back to America. So the place they wanted to be was where their love of music had started, which was in America, in the States. Yeah. That's where they needed to be.
That is fantastic. Just I got to ask you this because, you got the Stones, you got the Beatles. Were they or were they not friends with the Stones?
Oh, yeah, they were very good friends.
Okay.
It was the Stones manager, Andrew Lou Goldman. And he'd worked out, he was very, very good at marketing. He did some stuff with the Beatles as well. And he thought, well, the Beatles have got this one image. We've got to do something that's the opposite. And so they weren't in suits. They had the longer hair. They were the rebels. They were the bad boys, which is sort of what John really wanted the Beatles to be. But the Stones' first hit single was I Want to Be Your Man, Lennon-McCartney song, which they'd only given to Ringo on the album. So they gave that to Mick and Keith for the Stones, and that was their first UK hit.
Wow. So
they would often hang out together. They were good friends.
Who was the better writing team, you think? McCartney and Lennon or Richards and Jagger?
I don't think there's anybody ever will top Lennon McCartney.
Okay.
They're just geniuses, absolute geniuses.
And let's go too far into the future. I was going to ask, why did they actually break up? But I know people still understand music is ego, music is personalities, and it's hard to get those things together. It doesn't matter how much money or how much fame you have.
Yeah, and they basically were living with each other constantly for like 7 years. Beatlemania taken over. You couldn't walk down the street. And once they stopped touring at the end of '66, then they were spending months and months in the studio.
Wow.
But the big thing that changed is when Brian Epstein suddenly died in the summer of '67. And he was only 32 years old. Brian was the guy. Without him, they wouldn't have got out of Liverpool. And with Brian gone, they wouldn't replace him with another manager.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the beginning of the end of them sort of drifting apart.
That's something. What's your favorite Beatles album, by the way?
Oh, I often get asked this question, and I'll normally come down and say Abbey Road, which was the last one they ever recorded. Mm-hmm. And probably because I think George's songs are as good as anything that John and Paul wrote with that album. It's just a brilliant album. The way they put it together, and even the fact they were hardly in the studio all together at the same time. They put together this absolute work of art, and you think, well, go out at the top. Yeah. And you couldn't really top that. It was a fantastic album.
Okay, so I have to ask you some. I have to ask you some this or that questions. And it's
okay,
because I've got so many questions. We could go on for hours, and I'm gonna. So I'm gonna ask you questions. You can answer like one or the other. not neither or both, and let's just have some fun with it and see where we're going.
I'm good for that. Yep.
As a matter of fact, one of the questions I have to ask you is, you've got the Ed Sullivan Show and you've got the rooftop concert at the end of their career. Which one do you go for?
Rooftop.
Rooftop was brilliant, wasn't it?
It's absolutely. And we've seen it when Disney put on the Get Back series, and you saw the rooftop concert. Like, that was just spine tingling. And you know, the interesting thing when you're watching that is that they're up there, and it's almost as if they're in full color looking at the future. Then the cameras go down to the street. It's almost like it's in black and white and 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
The disconnected is massive, but the rooftop, I just love that. Fabulous.
The rooftop, it seems like if you could take the movie Fame, that would be Fame on steroids with the rooftop concert, right?
Yeah, definitely. I love it.
Okay. How about Liverpool or Hamburg?
Depends of what you mean by this, because I'm actually working on a documentary at the moment about the Beatles in Hamburg.
Okay.
And without Hamburg, you wouldn't have had the Beatles. But without Liverpool, you wouldn't have had the Beatles. So I think what they needed to do was they had to start in Liverpool, but they had to go to Hamburg to progress. Yeah. But after Hamburg, they had to go to London. And one of the other books that I've done, which is this one here, with two friends of mine, the Beatles Fab Four Cities, we look at Liverpool, Hamburg, London, New York, and how similar all four cities are. These big cosmopolitan port cities. Wow. And they define the Beatles' career.
It is amazing. I have to say that from the little bit that I know, that the Hamburg time where they're spending hours playing and just honing their skills, I don't know if they could have done it without that.
No, it was essential. They had to go there. They had to spend that time on stage. Yeah. They learned everything about being a group while they were out in Hamburg. So, no Hamburg, no Beatles.
Okay, let's talk about some album covers. What about Beatles for Sale or Sgt. Pepper? Which one?
I love the concept of the Sgt. Pepper album. There's a great photo, and it's a McCartney family photo. And because Paul's dad, Jim, was a jazz musician, and other members of the family were musicians, and they got this wonderful photo of all the family together, sat around, and right in the middle is a bass drum with Jim Mack's band on. That's the family photo that inspires the cover for Sgt. Pepper. Yeah, and it's such an iconic cover.
Yeah, like we don't make album covers anymore and we don't make CD covers anymore. So there's no album art anymore.
Absolutely right, and that's a travesty.
It is. Liner notes are so much better than anything you can read on the internet.
Yeah, definitely. I'm with you on that.
Oh my God. I think I know that this is about you. Writing for fan club magazines or writing books? You've written many books, but do you write for any of the fan club magazines?
Well, I started writing for the London Beatles Fan Club, which then became the British Beatles Fan Club. Okay. So that was the first writing I ever did about the Beatles. But I love writing my books. It's the research. I really enjoy the research, and I'm still learning something new almost every day. There's still stuff to be learned. Yeah. Having that lunch with Colin Hanson today, and we were just chatting about the day John met Paul, and he said, "You know where you think the meeting took place? Actually, there's another room there." I think, "There's what?" And so we go off in another conversation. I think, okay, I'm going to have to revise what I know about that. I'm still learning stuff, and that's the fun. The fun of what I'm allowed to do is, go and meet all these people who've got a part in this incredible story, and I still learn something, and it's exciting. That's great.
Awesome. Let's play make believe. Well, they might have to make believe. How about the Beatles staying together or their solo careers?
It's an interesting one, this one, because I think with Abbey Road being the last album they recorded was absolutely superb. And solo, they all did some great stuff, but it was never as good. And I'd have liked it. sort of an in-between option, which was go off and do solo projects, but come together and do a Beatles album every couple of years.
That's why I loved Yes, because they did their thing and then they came back together and it was just magical. Except they couldn't stay together long enough. But
well, I was just going to say, not exactly known for staying together. Yes, are they? In the middle of a tour, when John Anderson decided it's time to go home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see. How about Hard Day's Night or Help? Need somebody.
That one's an easy one for me. Hard Day's Night.
Hard Day's Night.
It's the best music biopic type film that's ever been made.
Okay.
Everybody tries to make one like that because it was reflecting their normal life with little bits scripted thrown in, but it was so natural, and it's just a brilliant, brilliant film. And the soundtrack, I think, is almost becoming second to Abbey Road.
Yeah.
As to my favorite Beatles album.
Really?
The Hard Day's Night. Go and listen to that album again, the soundtrack to the film. It is absolutely brilliant.
What did you think about the whole Yellow Submarine film thing? I didn't get it.
No, I don't fully get it. I can see what they were trying to do. But of course, they weren't fully involved with the project. They sort of gave it their blessing. Off they went to make the film. Then they come and they write some songs for it. But it's something, again, about the genius of their songwriting, is that it can appeal to any generation and of any age.
I will agree with that. It really, really can. Here's another one. How about as far as fashion? We got mop top haircuts or Sgt. Pepper uniforms. What do you like better?
Ooh. I think they look good with the mop top and the suits. The Sgt. Pepper, you can see what they were trying to do. They never fully realized what they were trying to do with Sgt. Pepper, which was create these alter egos. So at the beginning of the album, you've got introducing Billy Shears and Ringo sings his song, but they never followed that on with their other personas, which is a shame. But so I think musically, but I think if you're going to go for either mop top or Sgt. Pepper, I'd definitely go for Hamburg.
Okay.
Which is the third option. Just to be awkward.
I like that Sgt. Pepper look. I thought that was a cool look.
Yeah, they look good. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. Okay, last one. The Beatles' music or their cultural impact?
I think the reason why we're doing this and why people will be doing this in another 150 years will always be about the music.
Okay.
Because the music is timeless. Just as we'll talk about Mozart and Beethoven, these classical composers from a long time ago, they'll still be talking about the Beatles because it is just great music, and it is still great music. And I think it always will be.
That's awesome. I want people to stay in touch with you for sure. And we're going to have to do this again because I know that we could talk for days at a time about the Beatles, about music in general. So we've got you at davidabedford.com. People can find
that's
you
me.
there. And also Liverpool Beatles podcast, liddypod.com.
Yep.
And we've also got BeatlesBookstore.com. And I'm going to leave this on the screen so that people can actually see it as we run out of here. This has been a fabulous conversation.
That's been great fun.
It has been really, really fun. I could sit here and just listen to you. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And
Pleasure.
we'll do this again. Everybody, we'll see you later. Peace.
Peace.